Could it be? But it's Yankel, so we have to ask. So he sends his messenger to call Yankel to the rabbi's office and says, Yankel, I'm sorry to do this. I know what you did today was a big mitzvah. The whole town is really proud of you. We're proud of our homegrown mitzvah. We're proud of you. But my watch is missing. Do you know anything about it? And so Yankel sighs and says, you're the rabbi. I can't lie. I'm not going to, I take things, but I don't lie. You're asking, I took it. It was too easy. You had it in front of me. It was sitting there. I took it. I took the watch. Here, you can have it back. He pulls it out of his pocket, gives it back to the rabbi. So to close it all up, the rabbi asks, I just don't understand you. How did this happen? You found the money, you returned it, the watch, you take it, all in the same day, all while doing the same thing. How did this happen? So Yankel says, look, I went to Cheder, right? I went to yeshiva, I went to Jewish school. There's a mitzvah that when you find something lost, you have to return it. That's a mitzvah. So you find something lost on the side of the road, you have to return it. It's a mitzvah, and I'm all for doing a mitzvah. So I found it, I returned it, I did a mitzvah. But Rabbi, business is business. Sorry.
1 second. Sorry. Continue. Sorry.
We're going to work on the playback back?
Yes. It's all good. Go for it.
Okay, so that's the we'll circle back. We'll circle back to that story. The story was obviously a good entry, but we'll actually circle back to that story. And that concept of doing a mitzvah, but business is business. We'll circle back. To start the class, though, so generally it is a Parsha class. This week, though, there is something special. There's something unique. And that is the Parsha is known as Parshas Zachor, which is in addition to the weekly Parsha. If you've come to class, you're familiar. There's a cycle. Throughout the year, we finish the entire book, the entire Chumash. Over the year, we finish it. Each week, we're reading a portion. However, every here and there, and if you're in shul, you'd see how if you're by services on Shabbos, you would see how it's done. At the end of the weekly portion, occasionally we'll add an additional portion from a different book, from a different portion that isn't that week's, but we will read it as the last reading in the synagogue after the weekly portion is over, and it's going to be connected with the time, with the time with the Jewish calendar, with the date on the Jewish calendar that we're reading a special portion, usually like a singular small portion in addition to the weekly parsha. And this week, the portion that we read, it's called Zachor, and it's about remembering what Amalek did to us. Amalek, the nation, they waged a war, the first war that the Jewish people faced after leaving Egypt. Yeah, the Egyptians chased them, but that wasn't a war. The Jewish people didn't fight the war. They went into the sea. God led them into the sea. They were saved. They were free. And the Jewish people, their first war they encountered as a nation. They were born. They left Egypt, and now they're their own nation, and God is leading them, and they're in the desert, and they're on their way to receive the Torah. The first war that they encountered was the Amalekite nation, the people from Amalek, that they came and they attacked the Jewish people. And it's a mitzvah to remember that the Amalekite people attacked us. And we read that portion of remembering that Amalek attacked us every year on the Shabbos before Purim. So it's a special portion in addition to the weekly portion. So today's class is going to be about Zachor, remembering Amalek, and that will replace for this week the lesson on the Parsha. So let's talk about that, remembering Amalek. So for that, actually, the text I want us to see is the 6 remembrances, and you'll find it in the prayer book, in the Siddur, on page 84. On page 84, there are the 6 mitzvahs that you have to remember. It doesn't mean that there's only 6 commandments, right? There's 613 commandments in all. But there's these 6 mitzvahs, the 6 commandments that are about remembering. So if you don't mind, would we be able to actually, would you be comfortable going around the table and someone reading from the text of the remembrances? So let's do that. Let's do the 6 remembrances, and we'll start with, and I guess when you start saying your name again, so I can remember that. Michal. Okay. So you'll lead us with the first of the remembrances. Read that in English.
So that you remember the day you came out of the land of Egypt, all the days.
Okay, so that's an easy one, pretty straightforward. And for those who can't hear it because of Zoom or whatever, pretty straightforward. Remember the fact that you left Egypt. All right, the second one, take it away. Also, Mike Michal, okay?
Making it easy, I suppose.
Yeah.
But beware and guard your soul scrupulously, lest you forget the things which your eyes have seen, lest they be removed from your heart all the days of your life.
Yeah, yeah.
Make known to your children and to your children's children what you saw on the day when you stood before the Lord your God as part of the
So this one, it was in more words, more lengthy, but what it said was to remember the giving of the Torah. Remember standing at Sinai and receiving the Torah. Okay, so far so good. Number 3.
John or Moshe ben Shmuel.
Moshe, okay, yeah.
I say that because I'm Sephardic
Okay.
and every Shabbat I come here, the rabbi has this big parade. When Paul's getting set there, I go to my family because I am Moshe ben Shmuel. My father was Shmuel ben Moshe. My son is Shmuel ben Moshe, my grandson.
Right.
So I had to say
Moshe ben Shmuel, but Moshe ben Shmuel.
remember what Amalek said did to you on the way as you came out of Egypt, how he met you on the way, cut down all the wheat which traveled behind you. When you were weary and exhausted, not fear God. Therefore, when the Lord our God will relieve you of all your enemies around you, the land which the Lord your God gives you as a hereditary portion, you shall not block out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Do not forget.
Okay, so this is the most words, the most lengthy, the most verses, but this is remember what Amalek did to you. So far we have remembering leaving Egypt, remember receiving the Torah, remember what Amalek did to you. Okay, number 4.
David, I forgot my glasses. Thanks, David. Remember, do not forget how you spoke the word of your God to wrath in the desert.
Okay, so this one's very vague. Remember how you got God angry. It's referring to the golden calf. So it's referring to idol worship, and okay, so it could even be a larger principle. Remember that idol worship makes God angry, and how when we did serve idols, it didn't turn out well. Okay, so that's the 4th one.
Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam.
Okay, so again, a little vague. It doesn't give us the whole background. Remember what the Lord your God did to Miriam on the way out of Egypt. That story is that she spoke about Moshe negatively behind his back, what we call as lashon hara. She spoke negatively about him, about personal matters in his life, and she was speaking with her brother Aaron, the 3 siblings, Miriam, Aaron, and Moshe, and Miriam was speaking to Aaron about Moshe and about how they disapproved of something of his life, and she then God punished her with a leprosy, Surres, due to this slander. So this is a remembrance, not to forget, about the negative effects of slander and speaking about each other in a negative way behind the back. All right, what do we have next? Shayna?
I am Shayna. Remember the Shabbat day to sanctify.
So remember Shabbos. Okay, I want to take a moment to think about all 6 of these and sort of to create a pattern. And there really is a couple of questions that we could address regarding this week and this week being remembering Amalek and the significance of remembering Amalek. But the way to do that, let's for a minute talk about the mitzvah of remembering. So we have these 6 mitzvahs that are to remember. Not every mitzvah that you have to do is there a mitzvah that you have to remember, right? There's a mitzvah to give charity. There's no mitzvah to remember to give charity, right? There's a mitzvah to do so many things. There's not a mitzvah to remember to do those things. So when it says there's a mitzvah to remember to do something, it also comes together generally with a date. That at least annually will be once a year that you should set a time to focus on this message. And we'll find this pattern. Let's go through the 6 of them. Leaving Egypt. So really every Shabbos, by Kiddush, we mention that we left Egypt. But there's the holiday of Passover, Pesach. We're celebrating leaving Egypt. So by that, we are fulfilling the mitzvah of remembering that we left Egypt. We're celebrating it, right? Once a year, we celebrate that we left Egypt. It comes around always on the calendar, and through that, we're fulfilling the mitzvah of remembering that we left, receiving the Torah. It also has a holiday, the holiday of Shavuot. Shavuot is the day we receive the Torah. We mark that once a year. Again, an annual day in which we fulfill the mitzvah to remember that we receive the Torah. So far, so good. Amalek. Now, Amalek is a little bit more, I think the word is nuanced. It's a little more nuanced, and let me explain. The mitzvah originally was that once a year, and this is from Moshe, from the Bible, the mitzvah is once a year you shall read in the Torah the portion of Amalek. But no date was given to it. So what did they do? We know the Jewish people gathered in the synagogue once a year and they read the portion. When we don't have a record of it, there's no tradition. When Purim became a holiday, which Purim was much later, a miracle for the Jewish people in Persia that they were saved, and they were saved from the anti-Semite Haman, who was from the tribe of Amalek. So Purim itself marked the victory of the Jewish people over Amalek to some degree. The sages of that time then connected the mitzvah of reading the portion with the holiday of Purim. So there's a mitzvah to read the portion annually, just like there's a mitzvah to celebrate Passover annually. Right? It's a mitzvah to remember Amalek. So you have to read the portion every year. When do you read it? The way it is now in our tradition is to read it before Purim, because Purim itself is a celebration of defeating Amalek. So we defeated Amalek in Purim. Therefore, the Shabbos before it, we read about defeating Amalek. Right? In conclusion, though, for remembering Amalek, we kind of had 2 dates on the calendar. And we'll discuss that in a minute. But for Amalek, we've understood how it came to be, because it was read it in the Torah, and then the holiday of Purim came about, and then we connected them. But the end result, this mitzvah we kind of keep twice a year. The mitzvah of remembering Amalek, on Purim, we're remembering the story of Purim, which is then, in effect, remembering our victory over Amalek, as well as the Shabbos before Purim, we'll read it in shul, in synagogue. Remember how you got God mad. Now, the next 2 will actually be exceptions, because we don't want to have days that mark something negative for the Jewish people, or to remember something bad, negative in our history. So the next 2 are actually things we have to remember, but bad stories. The fact that we got God angry in the desert, idol worship. The fact that Miriam had received a punishment for speaking bad about Moshe. So there is no date that's placed on these. We don't have an annual remembrance of Miriam, or the Miriam story. We don't have an annual remembrance of the golden calf, simply because we don't want to establish a date to remember things that are negative for the Jewish people. But when do we do the mitzvah? There is no date to it officially, but we kind of are fulfilling the mitzvah whenever we discuss it. And chances are you'll discuss it when the Parsha comes up about the golden calf. You're going to discuss it. When the Parsha about Miriam, you'll discuss it. It ends up happening that you will remember it, and it's in the prayers. So if you're doing this part of the prayer, you're constantly remembering it. But there is no date on the calendar that marks these events, being that they are they're a non-positive angle on the Jewish people. So we don't make events for that. Shabbos is the most represented. Shabbos is every week, right? We remember Shabbos by keeping Shabbos. So every week we're remembering Shabbos. That being the setup of these 6 mitzvahs, there is potentially a question that I would like to discuss, and that is Amalek does seem to be a little bit over represented. Shabbos is weekly, so that actually is the most. However, Shabbos it's on the weekly calendar. It's not based on the yearly calendar. It's based on the weekly cycle. Once a week there's Shabbos, so it's really once every week, and that's how it's established. The other of the remembrances, which have a date attached to them, are annual, and therefore they're once a year. The holiday of Pesach, the holiday of Shavuot. Once a year, holidays. Amalek, yes, one was a holiday that came later, and one was an enactment already from the beginning that you have to read it in the Torah. But we do Now, when we examine the playing field of the things we have to remember, there does seem to be an over-representation to remember the story of Amalek. As if to say, as if the message is that it is exceedingly important. So important, in fact, that we'll speak about it on Shabbos and next Thursday. That's how important it is, that we have 2 days that we'll talk about. Why is it so important? Let's actually elaborate on that question. This was a technical angle. We have it twice versus receiving the Torah, we only have it once in the year. Let's elaborate on that by discussing the concepts that are behind what we're remembering. And really, Amalek is the exception to the other 5. The other 5 are very, I would say, intuitive and easily understood as to why they're foundational to Jewish continuity and why we have to always remember them. We can't ever forget leaving Egypt. That's the birth of a people. We have to remember we're the Jewish people who left Egypt. We have to remember receiving the Torah. That's our charter. That's our mission. Our life's mission is the Torah. We receive the Torah. It's an obligation. It's a responsibility. We can't forget receiving the Torah. We can't forget that idol worship is bad. That's also pretty foundational. We have to constantly remind ourselves of the one true power of Hashem. And even if it's not idol worship in the sense of, as we find biblically, the actual statues and monuments that they would set up and worship, but it could mean other influences, other non-godly influences, which seem to pull us in directions away from Torah, and we think of them as being in power. Whatever social construct is in place, or the government, or what's popular, and potentially these are powers which we think might the key to our future might be in their hands. And we have to remind ourselves that everything's really in the hand of Hashem all the time. So this is constant. It affects the way we act all the time. We have to remember that everything's in the hands of Hashem. Not speaking gossip. That's the foundation to the continuity of the Jewish people, of a healthy people. We need to be united. If there's no unity to the Jewish people, then unfortunately there is no Jewish people. We have to stick together. We can't be creating divide from the inside, even if we feel like we have some really good schmutz, even if we have some really good things that we might know about someone and their personal lives. It's not our business to go around peddling that information. Why? Because that will destroy us. That will destroy the Jewish people. For our continuity, we need to view each other positively and need to promote positive connection. Right? So that makes sense. Remember not to speak gossip. And I'll add to that just as a bit of a tangent, or parenthetically, it's so easy to forget this one. It's so easy to forget. Gossip is something that happens in conversation all the time. So it's especially important that we have it, in front of our faces as please remember not to speak gossip. Right? And that's important to the social construct and continuity of the Jewish people. Shabbos, God creating the world. It affects, well, first of all, it's our lifestyle. It affects our work week, that we're constantly building towards resting on Shabbos and keeping our stores and businesses closed on Shabbos, as well as the message of Shabbos is God created the world. Therefore, we're putting it in His hands once a week, and we're focusing on things that matter, which is family and our relationship with Hashem, our relationship with God. So those 5 are extremely foundational and essential to the Jewish people and the ideology of the Jewish people, the continuity of the Jewish people. Now, Amalek. Is it that important to remember that there's like this nation that came and fought with us? Okay, and their descendants also don't like us. We have Haman many years later, and he's from the tribe of Amalek. So they have a sort of inherited sense of anti-Semitism. But is it really that important to constantly remember that? And from a halachic point of view, it actually has no practical implementation at all. What do I mean by that? Amalek is a nation that, from we know biblically, they lived around the Negev Desert in the southern region of Israel. Even if we're someone to come and be indigenous to that area, we wouldn't treat them as coming from Amalek. The reason being, because of Sancherib, exactly. Historically, so this is 700 before Common Era, 700 BCE. Sancherib, who was the ruler, the king of the Assyrian Empire, as a way of unsettling and destabilizing the nations of the world in order to strengthen and in his mind to entrench his empire. He took all the nations and mixed them up. He set everyone in exile, so no one should be comfortable, so no one should have any strength to then create an uprising. So the people from Amalek, from that region, were sent all across the world, and other people were sent into that region. So even nowadays, if we were to trace someone's, genealogy, that they have traces to that region, to the Negev desert, we wouldn't assume that they're an Amalekite, and we don't have to hate them or destroy them, right? Be kind. You don't have to hurt anyone. So it has no practical. Anyway, that's a little bit of history, but there's no practical implementation to this at all. So remember that Amalek is a bad nation, and you have to annihilate them. It has no practical meaning to us, and its concept. Why is it so important? Why is it so important that there's this enemy who tried to destroy us, who got in our way, who was the first war? We've had many enemies since then. We've had many anti-Semites since then. What is the big deal? Why is Amalek that important? And then this question then built on the question we had before, and to remind everyone, it's twice every year. We have a Shabbos that is all about remembering Amalek. We have Purim, which is again about remembering Amalek. Why is it so important, this whole Amalek story? What is it really about? So we're done with the Siddur for now. We've analyzed the 6 remembrances. To get to the answer, I would like to introduce a Kabbalistic angle to the nation of Amalek, and for that we'll use the Chumash. So let's open to page 450. Page 457. So on page 457, we have a couple verses, and it's about Amalek and remembering Amalek.
Read this on Purim Day.
Yeah. So I'm actually going to read it in Hebrew because the Hebrew here will be very important. So it's the last verse. It has a small tezayin in front of it. I'll read it and then we'll see the translation. Vayomer, I'll read it and translate. Vayomer, he said, Ki yad al kes Hashem. There is a hand on the throne of God, which is a symbolism of swearing. The hand of God is holding his throne, and he's swearing that Milchama la Hashem ba'Amalek, that there shall be a war of God against Amalek, midar dar, from generation to generation. So God swears to himself and upon his holy throne, upon his chair. He's holding his chair and says, I swear upon this holy chair that just as it is eternal, so too I promise that there will be a war until the end of times with Amalek. Okay, so this is all hyperbole. It's pretty extreme. It's God's war until the end of time. But I want to focus on something in the Hebrew, which the commentators point out, and that is we say God twice in the verse. There is the hand on the throne of God, and says there will be a war of God. Now in the Hebrew, they're written different. The first one is a yud and a hey, which generally speaking is half the name of God. The second time is the full name of God, the 4-letter name of God, a yud, a hey, a vav, and a hey. Right? So we start off with the hand of God is on his throne, but there when we say God, we use only the first half of his name. To say that God has a war, and there's the full name of God, God has a war forever. What's with that? Why in these verses about Amalek do we have God's name written only the first 2 letters? So really the only angle when you have a question about God's name, it's Kabbalah that you look at, because Kabbalah is where you'll find explanations on the name of God and significance of the letters. So we will open up a bit of a discussion, an explanation from Kabbalah, Hasidic thought, about the name of God, and why when it comes to Amalek, there's only a yud and a hey. But before we get to that, there is actually the simple commentators on the verse. This is important. This comes from the Talmud. The Talmud says that the reason why it's half, it's only the yud and the hey, is because God is saying that my name is incomplete until I defeat Amalek. So this is what the commentators say. It's from the Talmud. My name is incomplete. I only have a yud and a hey. I don't have the whole name. My name is incomplete. I am missing. I'm not fully God until I have the war with Amalek and I defeat Amalek, and then my name is complete. Right? So that's why my hand is on the throne and there it only says half the name, because God is saying I am incomplete. My name is incomplete until I defeat Amalek. But that potentially only raised more questions than answers. So let's enter that. Yeah.
I have a question if I could. I was thinking about this today. I've heard about God has names, but why would he have a name? Person asked what's your name. He got a name, but was that name used for the creation of man?
This is perfect. This is perfect. This is a perfect way. Great question, and a perfect way to open this discussion. Because that's really the starting point that Kabbalah will look at God's name to be. And what we're going to want to understand is what is the four-letter name of God and what it means that it's incomplete until we defeat Amalek. So the name of God, it means his characteristics. That's how Kabbalah understands it. Similar, when it speaks about God's name, it's all in some way titles. It's in some way titles. The way you would call someone a warrior, or you would call someone a sage. There are titles that show on the character of the person. That's how Kabbalah sees the name of God. Because God really is, and as Kabbalah delves deeper and deeper, God is just existence. He exists. He's the essence of all that is. So there isn't really names. What is names with God, right? It's a construct. What's a name? A name is his characteristics that he adopts in order to then create a world and interact with the world. So, he's then, one of his names could mean that he's ruler and king, because the way he interacts with us as a ruler and as a king. So that's how we relate to him. So that would be a name of God. So there's actually many names of God, and each name shows on different characteristics and the way he relates to the world. Let's discuss the four-letter name of God. And for this, we're going to require, I promised myself entering this class that we will try to keep this section as clear, even though it's Kabbalistic. We will try keeping this as clear and concise as possible. So let's, please God that I succeed.
Thank you.
So let's talk about the four-letter name of God, and that names of God mean his characteristics. When we just say God, there's different names. There's the word that's Adonai, which is master, which shows on God being the master. But when we say God, plain, in Hebrew, the way that would be written is the yud, the hey, the vav, and the hey. That's the way it would be written. That's God, so to speak, plain. That's him. Why is that the name that's used in most circumstances? So Kabbalah explains that by examining the letters are characteristics and waves of energy. And if the actual symbolism of the letter, which we'll discuss, is in itself symbolic of an energy and a characteristic. And it's an all-encompassing name because this name is the process of a essential energy or power, godly power, which has no definition, which is undefined, which is limitless, and as it goes through the stages to then create a world. Right? So there's sort of layers. You have to go from something unlimited into something way more defined. And those steps is this name of God. The Yud, the Hey, the Vav, and the Hey. Let's get straight to it. The first place of, a very important principle is that we were created, it says this in Genesis, we were created in the image of God. Nasa Adam, B'Tsalmenu Kidnusenu. God says, I will create man in my image. Which means that the way we understand the psychological human psyche, our process from, simple life energy, into the actualization of that energy when we do things and express things, that's the same process that God goes through in a much more, or at least that's our point of reference to understand what God goes through. If that makes sense. So let's talk about the yud and the hey. The yud, it's a simple point. It's really just a dot. It has a little bit more, color than a dot, but it's really just a dot. Let's talk about that process within the human being. What process are we referring to? Usually we'll use as an example the intellectual process. Whereas when you take a concept which is foreign to you, you then understand it, and you then implement it. Right? You understand it, you then will even have feelings towards what you understood. It will affect your worldview, and then you will do things based on that understanding. So there's that process that it goes through. The first thing is a yud. A yud is a simple realization. It's the proverbial light bulb. When you're studying something and there's a light bulb of, wow, this makes sense, but you can't yet explain why it makes sense and how it makes sense, but there's a light bulb. That's what that light bulb depicts. There's a moment of revelation. There's wow, this makes sense, but you don't yet know how. That's a yud, because it's just like a flash of energy. It then leads into the hey, and the hey, symbolically, its shape, it's actually a sort of three-dimensional shape. That's what it's about. It's a y-axis, an x-axis. That's the square part of the hey, and then there's a third dot, which is meant to symbolize really the z-axis, that it goes inward. So it's three-dimensional. What does that mean? Because every thought, once you have the light bulb, you then take a thought and you develop it three-dimensionally. In what way? There's then the thoughts, the concepts, applications. Let's go straight to an example, because this will help everyone. So let's go to an example of the concept of every human being has rights. Okay, that's the concept that you might have spent some time studying, or it clicked in your head. Every human being has rights. Then there's the y-axis, which is the way its application. It goes straight downward. Straight downward is, in what scenarios do I apply this? In more and more problematic, complex scenarios, how do I apply the principle that every human being has a right to choose? Every human being has a right to choose their own destiny. How do I apply that in a myriad of scenarios? That's the line where you have to take the thought and really develop it. Then there's the x-axis, which is, what are the parameters of this thought? What are its limitations? You can't apply that everywhere. Everyone has their own right to choose, but there's limits to that. What if you're infringing on someone else's rights? There's the way that affects other principles. And so that's the width. The y-axis is the way the thought, the concept, its limitations, its parameters, and its consequences. Its consequences on other thoughts, on other principles. Then there's the depth, which is the third point, the z-axis, which is the underlying principle. Why do I believe every human being has the right to choose? And if you would ask from a religious perspective, why does everyone have the right to choose? Everyone has a right to choose because it's God's world and God's universe. And he created within us free will. And that free will was to implant within us that right that we could choose. So therefore, it's immoral and it goes against God's will for his universe, were we to take a human being and lock him up in a room and not give him choices, right? So we could discuss all day the concept of how every human being has rights. But then there's a question of what's the underlying principle? Why do you believe everyone has rights? And that's sort of going into it, taking the depth. And that's the third angle, which is, why do you believe that? And for that, we would say the reason we believe it is because it's God's universe. Anyway, that was really an example, but this can be applied to all thought experiments. So this can be applied to all thoughts. For now, we'll leave it at that. The yud and the hey is when a light bulb goes on in your head, and then you develop that thought with its implementations, with its depth, with its ramifications. That's the yud and the hey. So the yud and the hey is the intellectual exercise of taking a inspiration. Or let's talk about it really in a holy way. You're studying Chumash and you feel inspired. You don't yet know why, but you feel a surge of inspiration. Then after rereading the text, you'll find within it the lessons that moved you. You'll find within it the meaning, the thing that moved you. What moved me? You're not sure yet. You're just inspired. Then you reread it and you see its application, its meaning. Right? So that's the yud and the he. You're inspired, you've understood it, you feel good. The vav and the he. What's the next vav and the he? The vav and the he is as that goes even further. Even further means beyond the intellectual exercise, there's its expression. And the vav is the expression. The vav is a more expression within the person. You choose to study. You choose to think about it. You choose to learn more. You've studied some Torah, you were inspired. Now what? You choose to learn more. You choose to study more. That's the vav.
The vav, is that a hook?
Yes, it's the implementation of the inspiration within the person's own choices. But it's all within. Then comes the last day. The last day is also three-dimensional because it goes beyond the person. It's when he does a mitzvah, when he does an actual mitzvah, which it could be charity to a fellow, so it's using things beyond him. It could be the way it's affecting his workplace because he's keeping Shabbos. It's affecting his family. So it's it's three-dimensional because it goes beyond him. So implementing the inspiration in the vav and the he are studying more Torah and performing the mitzvah.
The choice, make the choice versus the action. Choosing to say I'm going to study, not deciding. I could study.
There's a difference in the letters. There wouldn't be a difference, but one would be like at the top of the vav, one would be at the bottom of it. But in other words, that's where that is. The choice when it becomes practical, when you're implementing it beyond inspiration. When you're implementing it beyond inspiration, the top of that vav is the choice to do it. The bottom of the vav is where you actually, right? And the hey is when you actually take that in.
You can get inspired and walk away.
Right. Even within the vav, potentially there could be stops. But
Top of the vav is a yud.
so you could get stuck. But the vav itself is the choice, but when it's practical. And it's practical, and then hopefully it's truly implemented. Exactly. That's the vav and the he. That all being said, let's close the Kabbalistic angle on it. I hope this was clear. The point. Let's discuss our takeaway, because this was what mattered. The takeaway is that the yud and the he is abstract energy or an intellectual exercise, intellectual inspiration. The vav and the he is the way that then relates to practice. The vav and he is the way that relates to practice. What is Amalek? And let's discuss Amalek beyond the nation that chose to attack the Jewish people, but let's use that as our starting point. Let's use that as our case study. What did Amalek do? Amalek came at a time of extreme theological clarity. And by that I mean, it was hardly questioned at that moment in time in history that the Jewish people were the chosen people, and that God is the God, and that God chose the Jewish people and took them out of Egypt and destroyed the Egyptian empire and is now creating his nation and is now giving them a Torah and a mission, and they're chosen. And all of that was pretty clear to anyone following the news. All you had to do was know what Egypt was, know what Egypt became, and there was clarity. There was clarity that there's a master to this universe and that he has chosen the Jewish people. And Amalek knew that. And Amalek said, we know that they're the chosen people. We know that they're on a mission. We are not going to treat them as chosen people. We are choosing that there should not be a physical, we are going to challenge the physical implementation of that vision. They're chosen. They're the chosen people. We're going to challenge how that expresses itself in our reality. We're not going to let them act chosen. We're going to challenge them. We're going to go to war with them. We're not going to let them implement whatever it is, the changes, the good, godly changes that they want in this universe. We're going to challenge them. We know that they're right. We know that they were chosen. We know that God wants them. We know that God gave them a mission, but we're going to get in the way. We are going to. We know the Yud and the He. We have clarity. We have inspiration. We know that the Jewish people were chosen and that God is giving them the Torah. We challenge the Vav and the He. We will get in the way of it being implemented within the world. We won't allow it to be expressed in the physical reality. So the idealism, the concept, yeah, there's a God and God is choosing the Jewish people, but in our world, this ain't gonna fly. In our world, we're going to fight them. And they're going to be a nation like any nation, and they're going to have to fight for their survival like any nation. Or we're actually going to pick them out and really bully them. But in our world, they're not going to trot around like the chosen. They're not going to have an easy time. Because in our world, we are going to prevent them from actually implementing with tangible results the ideology that it's based on. Applying that more inwardly and to the Amalekite that we're constantly remembering and we don't want to forget, that's a voice that we all potentially relate to. This is a voice that says the inspiration, the yud and the head, the inspiration. I feel good about a class. I learned something, and first there was a yud, there was a flash of spiritual inspiration, and then I explored it and I understood what it was that inspired me. And there's so much lessons to be had. But then I'll walk away, and in the words of Yankel, business is business. I'll walk away from Torah, I'll walk away from my study, and business is business. There will be that divide, that challenge from being the chosen people to implementing change in a tangible way. There'll be a divide from being inspired and acting different. And that's Amalek's message. And that goes beyond the historical narrative of the nation of Amalek, which attacked the Jewish people. They were a message. They're actually a force that God put into this world. So it's part of our challenge is to overcome the Amalek and to constantly remember them.
Plus, I mean,
Yes.
it's not that it's us to return. Others might.
Yes, we'll talk about that in 1 second. We could close with that, but what was it?
That's what I was gonna ask. Does that relate to the pasuk that we see before the Parsha Class?
L'shem Yichud. Yes. Very well said. Yeah, there's a part of the prayers we say that we're praying for the sake of the unification of the Yud Hey of Hashem's name and the Vav Hey of Hashem's name. And so we're saying that in the prayer because we, and as was just said so beautifully, it is our job to break this divide. It's our job to overcome Amalek. And it's so important to remember it that maybe twice a year isn't enough. Let's do it again and again, but it's more than just the receiving of the Torah. It's more than just leaving Egypt. This is something that's so easy to forget. And that is that we have to take the ideological truths, the inspirational truths, and we have to implement them in small changes, but small changes of a little bit more Shabbos, a little bit more kosher, a little bit more love, a little less gossip, implementing a little more Torah study. The decision to come back next week for Torah study, and if possible, to add another Torah session, whatever it is, wherever it is that you're holding, in that journey of taking that charter, that God's charter of the Torah, and implementing it within your life and within your surroundings, wherever you're holding, but to take it that next level. And Amalek is always going to be there at each step and says, the inspiration is good, that was great, but business is business. And so let's go back to Yankel and let's circle around. And with this, we will close that our mitzvah of remembering Amalek is to bridge that gap. It's to remember that the mitzvah that Yankel did, that he did a mitzvah for Hashem and he returns the lost object, it's not true that there's a mitzvah and that business is business. The mitzvah is God and business is God. And our mission in this universe is to bridge that gap, that our business should be more mitzvah and our mitzvah should be more connected to business, to bridge that gap. And with that, we're remembering Amalek, we're defeating Amalek, and at that point, the name of God is complete. And I think that's it, right? We made it. So, l'chaim, and to remembering Amalek.
Chaim, l'chaim. Any questions? Any comments? This was young.